You know those moments in life when the air feels heavy before anyone speaks? That was the feeling in my chest the day I got called into the CFO's office. My name is Camille Turner. I am 38 years old, born and raised in Charlotte, North Carolina, and for almost 11 years, I worked as a senior financial strategist at Ironcrest Holdings, a mid-sized but fast-growing investment firm. I have built my life on the belief that numbers tell the truth when nothing else does. Every projection I delivered, every risk model I built, was crafted like a surgeon stitching a heart. Precise, deliberate, and impossible to rush. But apparently, that was my fatal flaw. Ironcrest had recently brought in a new chief financial officer, Ethan Cole, 41 years old, tall, tanned, and too polished for a man who claimed to love authentic business. He had been with us for less than 4 months, yet somehow his style had already started bleeding into the company's DNA. I heard him in the hallway once telling a junior analyst, "We do not need to drown investors in details. They just need a good story." That made my jaw tighten. In my world, stories without data are just lies waiting to be caught. So when I got an email from his assistant that said, "Ethan would like to see you at 4 p.m., my instincts told me it was not going to be good. The office was all glass and chrome, modern in a way that made it feel cold. Ethan stood when I walked in, gave me a smile that was just a shade too casual, and gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Camille, I have been reviewing your work," he began, his tone smooth as though he was delivering a compliment. "Your models are impressive, meticulous, even. But they are, how do I put it, too thorough, too technical. We need something lighter, more digestible for our audience." I sat there, hearing each word like a pin dropping onto tile. Lighter? Digestible? This was not a food menu. This was high-stakes financial forecasting. I asked him, "Are you saying you want me to take out the compliance metrics? And the risk breakdowns? What, the stress test scenarios?" He waved a hand as though brushing away a fly. "Investors do not have time for all that. They want confidence, not caution." My blood warmed. Confidence without caution is called recklessness, and it costs people millions. Whoa, but he was not interested in my opinion. I saw it in his eyes. His decision had already been made. A few days later, HR called me in. There was no preamble, no gratitude for over a decade of service. They handed me a thin packet of papers and a severance agreement. My badge was deactivated before I even made it back to my desk. I stood there for a long moment, looking at the monitors where my models still sat open, knowing they would probably strip them apart before they understood what they were destroying. When a junior analyst I had mentored for 5 years glanced at me with wide eyes but said nothing. I could feel the silence in the room stretching out like a shadow. Walking out of that building for the last time was like stepping into a different gravity. I was angry, but not the kind of angry that burns out quickly. This was the kind that sits low in your chest and waits. I knew Ethan thought he had replaced me with someone who would make his life easier. He probably believed my work was nothing more than a set of spreadsheets anyone could replicate. What he did not know, what he could not possibly have known, was that my most critical models did not belong to Ironcrest at all. They belonged to me. Years ago, I had taken steps to protect my intellectual property under my own LLC. Those models were my lifeline, my signature, and my proof that precision still mattered. As I drove home, my phone lit up with messages from colleagues. "I cannot believe this. They are making a mistake. Ethan is changing everything." I read them but did not respond. And not yet. There is a kind of revenge that does not require shouting or throwing punches. And it is the kind that works quietly in the background, biding its time until the exact right moment. And that day, as much as I wanted to storm back into that glass office and demand an explanation, I knew my silence would be worth far more than my outrage. And by the time I pulled into my driveway, the shock had settled into something sharper. Ironcrest had let me go because my work was too thorough. Fine. Let them live with the consequences of cutting corners. I did not know then exactly how or when the opportunity would come, but I knew this. When it did, I would be ready, and I would make sure they never forgot what they threw away. In the Monday after my termination, I woke up at 7 a.m. out of sheer habit. For over a decade, my mornings had been fueled by a strict routine. Coffee at my desk by 7:45, market scans done by 8:15, internal risk checks completed before the first investor call. That morning, I sat at my kitchen table instead, staring at my phone, fighting the urge to log into my work email even though my access had been cut. I kept wondering how Ethan would handle the Monday briefing without the models I used to prepare over the weekend. And a part of me wanted to believe he would stumble. Another part knew he was arrogant enough to think he had it under control. 2 days later, I got my first piece of confirmation. A former colleague, Lucas Grant, messaged me privately. "You would not believe this. Ethan presented to the board today. No compliance annex, no stress tests, nothing. Just 5 slides with big fonts and vague bullet points. He called it vision-driven forecasting." I could almost hear the groan in Lucas's voice through the text. Ethan had stripped away everything that made our projections bulletproof and replaced them with what I could only describe as financial theater. Ironcrest's culture had never been perfect, but until Ethan arrived, we had built our reputation on depth. Our investors trusted us because our numbers could withstand scrutiny from any regulator, auditor, or skeptical shareholder. Now, it sounded like he was betting everything on charm and presentation. And the problem with that approach is simple. Charm does not answer when the numbers stop adding up. And the numbers always stop adding up eventually. I learned from Lucas that Ethan had started referring to my work as overcomplicated in meetings. And he told the team they needed to think like storytellers, not statisticians. That line made my stomach twist. Storytelling has its place, but in finance, stories without the truth are just rehearsed lies. Investors are not children waiting for a bedtime tale. They are putting millions on the line. It was only a matter of time before someone noticed the gaps. I spent that week reading the markets, watching Ironcrest's portfolio performance from a distance. Nothing catastrophic had happened yet, but subtle signs were there. A slight dip in investor confidence metrics. 2 portfolio managers moving meetings to later in the quarter without explanation. Those kinds of delays often meant questions were being asked behind closed doors. The kind of questions Ethan's slides could not answer. One night, I found myself pulling up a copy of my last set of proprietary models, the ones that belonged to me and not to Ironcrest. Seeing the complexity, the interconnected data layers, the predictive algorithms I had spent years refining. It felt like staring at a loaded weapon I had designed myself. Not for harm, but for protection. If Ironcrest was still leaning on those models without my consent, I knew exactly how to make it stop. And if they were not, they would soon realize they had no replacement that could do the job. As the days passed, my resentment shifted into something colder and more deliberate. This was no longer just about being wronged. This was about watching a company trade integrity for aesthetics, knowing full well the reckoning would come. Ethan thought he had made the firm more marketable. I knew he had made it more fragile. And fragility has a way of shattering at the worst possible moment. I have always believed that preparation is the quietest form of power. You do not need to wave it around or announce it to the room. You simply keep it ready for the day someone underestimates you. That belief is exactly why, 3 years before Ethan ever walked into Ironcrest Holdings, I negotiated a clause in my employment contract that most people would have skimmed past without a second thought. As it was buried deep in Section 14, between vacation accrual and non-compete terms, and it stated in clear, unshakable language, any proprietary model or forecasting methodology created by Camille Turner outside of company time, on personally owned equipment, and without company resources, shall remain her sole intellectual property. At the time, the head of HR glanced at the sentence, shrugged, and initialed the margin. They probably assumed I would never create anything outside of my day-to-day workload. What they did not know was that for years, I had been refining my own forecasting framework on my personal systems, running simulations after hours, building a tool that could detect long-term market risks before most firms even recognized a pattern. That tool, my proprietary model, was not just an asset. It was my fingerprint. I had always kept a strict separation between my work for Ironcrest and the work that belonged to my own LLC, Turner Analytics, which I had quietly registered back in my late 20s for freelance consulting. My model lived entirely on encrypted drives I owned, never on Ironcrest servers, never in their cloud. I shared snapshots of its results when necessary, but never the full architecture. That architecture was mine. My years, my sweat, my signature. And thanks to that clause, it was protected. When Ethan fired me, I left the building with my head high, not just because I knew my worth, but because I knew my safety net was already in place. Ironcrest could try to replicate my work, but without the underlying algorithms, they would only be left with a hollow shell. They could dress up their presentations however they wanted, but the foundation would be missing. And eventually, someone would notice. In finance, missing foundations always crack under pressure. And it is funny, looking back, how the people who dismiss details are the same ones who get blindsided by them. Ethan thought his job was to simplify, to charm investors with easy slides and quick confidence. My job, for over a decade, had been to make sure that confidence was earned, not borrowed. And buried in my contract, sitting quietly in legal language that probably bored him to death, was the very thing that would turn the tables when the time came. At the moment, though, I did not rush to act. Timing matters in this game. Now, you do not throw your trump card on the table when the other player still believes they are winning. And you wait until they are leaning back, smiling, certain they have the hand sewn up. Then you watch their expression change when they realize the game is already over. That was exactly what I planned to do. Long before my final walkout of Ironcrest, I had been building something that no one else in that office fully understood. My proprietary forecasting system was not just a spreadsheet with formulas. It was a living framework, an interconnected web of algorithms I had coded, tested, and refined over the better part of a decade. Every parameter, every simulation, every predictive trigger had been calibrated through trial, error, and more late nights than I can count. And it was mine. All of it. Locked behind encryption keys and licensed under Turner Analytics, LLC, the small consulting business I had formed quietly years ago. I had learned early in my career that companies love to believe they own every ounce of brainpower you give them. They will tell you it is part of the job while they build empires on your ideas. We may know, but I also knew the law, and I knew how to separate personal intellectual property from corporate work product. Every serious model I created on my own time was documented, time-stamped, and registered. One, the paperwork was filed before anyone at Ironcrest even saw a sliver of what I could do. That meant when Ethan took my job and tried to erase my contributions, he could not actually touch the core of what made my work valuable. The funny part is that Ethan probably thought my models lived entirely inside Ironcrest's systems. He assumed he could keep running them after I was gone, just replacing my name on the files and calling them company-owned. But the real models, the fully functional, predictive versions, never touched Ironcrest's cloud. What they had was the surface layer, the outputs without the engine. It is like trying to drive a car after stealing the frame, but leaving the engine locked in someone else's garage. After the termination, I sat at my dining table one evening, pulling up my latest encrypted backup. The screen filled with familiar lines of code and multi-layered charts, projections stretching out over years, risk signals highlighted in sharp red and green. And I thought about how many times these models had saved the company from making dangerous investments, how they had turned losses into gains simply because I had caught the warning signs early. Now, without them, they were sailing blind. I closed the laptop with a slow, deliberate click. This was my insurance policy. Not one that paid out in cash right away, but one that would matter far more in the long run. Ironcrest might still be celebrating my absence in their boardroom, convinced they had replaced me with someone easier, but I knew what they did not. Their foundation had already been pulled out from under them. And when the pressure hit, that absence would echo loud enough for everyone to hear. I did not need to rush. I did not need to call anyone or demand anything. In the world of high finance, timing is the sharpest blade you can hold. And I intended to let it hang in the air until the exact moment it would cut deepest. It was barely 3 weeks after my termination when the first real crack appeared. I was at home on a Wednesday morning, halfway through my second cup of coffee, when my phone buzzed with a message from Lucas. "You are going to want to hear this," it read, followed by a link to a trade publication article. Mine being the headline was short, but it might as well have been flashing in neon. Ironcrest's $120 million deal with Harrington Ridge Partners faces unexpected delay. I clicked, scanning every line. The piece was diplomatic. Too diplomatic. But I knew how to read between the sentences. Harrington Ridge had requested additional due diligence on Ironcrest's risk analysis. In plain language, that meant they had looked at Ethan's stripped-down presentations and realized there was nothing of substance beneath the polished slides. No compliance annex. No long-term risk modeling. No stress test reports. Nothing that serious investors need before wiring $120 million into a project. Lucas filled in the rest when we spoke later that day. They asked him about the underlying methodology, Camille. He could not answer. Said something about the proprietary nature of the models, but they pushed back. They wanted to see the real data. I almost smiled. Of course they did. Those were investors known for tearing apart every projection before signing anything. My models had always satisfied them because they could see exactly how every number was built. Now, they were looking at a hollow shell. Ethan, apparently, had tried to stall by promising updated materials by the end of the month. But I knew the truth. There was no updated material to give. The full architecture of those forecasts lived on my encrypted drives under Turner Analytics. The moment I walked out of Ironcrest, their access to the functional model ended. What they had left were screenshots and fragments, useless without the algorithms to generate accurate projections. And the idea that this was happening so soon was almost poetic. I'd expected them to limp along for months before hitting the wall, but Harrington Ridge was too smart, too cautious, and too unwilling to gamble on something that smelled off. In a way, I respected them for it. If they had not caught the flaws now, the losses later could have been catastrophic. Still, as much as part of me enjoyed the idea of Ethan squirming in front of those investors, I kept my reaction measured. This was not the moment to intervene. Not yet. A deal like this does not collapse overnight. It unravels piece by piece, and the longer the unraveling is visible, the more trust it destroys. I wanted them to feel every inch of that unraveling before they realized where they had gone wrong. As I closed the article and set my phone down, I could not help but think about how different this story would have been if they had simply valued the work I gave them. If they had seen the detail not as a burden, but as a shield. But they did not. They wanted lighter, simpler, faster. And now, that choice was costing them $120 million and counting. It was a rainy Thursday morning when I first learned that my name had crept back into Ironcrest's boardroom. I was answering emails for a small consulting project when my lawyer, Renee Vasquez, called me. Renee has the kind of voice that never rises or falls. She could tell you your house was on fire and somehow make you feel calm. "Camille," she said, "we have a situation. Ironcrest is still using your models." I sat back in my chair, gripping the phone tighter. "How do you know?" I asked. She explained that Harrington Ridge had requested the original forecasting framework, the one I had created, not the watered-down version Ethan had been showing them. In response, Ironcrest had sent them a document that looked like my model on the surface, but without the full data architecture. And when Harrington Ridge asked for the complete methodology, Ironcrest claimed it was internally developed and could not be shared in full due to confidentiality. I could almost hear Renee's eyebrow raise through the phone. "Camille, that is your intellectual property. They are presenting it as theirs. We can send them a cease and desist today." She already knew my answer. "Undo it," I told her. "And make sure Harrington Ridge gets a copy." That afternoon, the formal notice went out. It was clean, professional, and unshakable in its legal language. The forecasting models in question were created outside the scope of employment, belonged solely to Turner Analytics, LLC, and were not licensed for use by Ironcrest Holdings. Continuing to use them would result in immediate legal action. No threats, no dramatic adjectives. Just facts sharp enough to draw blood without showing a blade. By evening, Lucas messaged me. "You should have seen their faces in the meeting today." The notice came through while they were on a call with Harrington Ridge. Ethan went pale. The board demanded answers. They have no idea what to do. I could almost picture it. The flash of panic, the scrambling for an explanation, the realization that their biggest deal was now tangled in a legal mess they could not bluff their way out of. The irony was almost too perfect. They had let me go because my work was too thorough, yet here they were, still trying to rely on the very same thoroughness they had dismissed. And now, without permission, that thoroughness had become a weapon pointed straight back at them. I closed my laptop that night with a deep, steady breath. I did not need to shout. I did not need to send an angry email or make a scene. All I had to do was protect what was mine and let the consequences unfold exactly as they were meant to. And the truth was, the consequences were only just beginning. The very next morning, Lucas called me from a number I barely recognized, his voice low like he was speaking from inside a closet. Camille, you would not believe it. The board meeting is a war zone. I leaned back in my chair, letting him talk. He said the cease and desist had detonated in the middle of a scheduled strategy session with Harrington Ridge on the line. Ethan had been halfway through promising updated compliance documents when Renee's legal notice popped into everyone's inbox. The room went dead silent. According to Lucas, the chairman of the board, Margaret Doyle, a woman known for her calm, surgical precision, turned to Ethan and asked, "Do we or do we not have legal rights to the models we have been presenting?" Ethan stammered something about derivative work and internal modifications, but Margaret cut him off with a single sentence. "That is not what the letter says." The head of compliance reportedly closed his laptop and muttered, "We cannot touch this without risking litigation." That was the moment the investors started asking if the deal could even move forward. Harrington Ridge was not amused. They asked for immediate clarification, and when Ethan could not produce a single piece of documentation proving Ironcrest owned the intellectual property, the managing partner on their end suggested they pause discussions until this matter is resolved. That is the kind of polite language investors use when they are already halfway out the door. Lucas told me Ethan looked like a man trying to keep a collapsing building upright with his bare hands. The presentation was scrapped, and the call ended early. And once the investors were gone, the board turned on him. "How could you let this happen? Why was there no review of her employment contract? What else have you been hiding from us?" Those questions flew across the table, one after another. Chewy tried to defend himself, blaming overly complicated legacy practices and claiming I had withheld parts of my work. But from the sound of it, no one was buying it. I could picture every detail as Lucas spoke. The tightening of jaws, the shifting of eyes, the way powerful people start calculating how much longer they can afford to be associated with someone before the fallout lands on them too. The irony was delicious. One fra on the same board that signed off on my termination without hesitation was now realizing they had amputated a limb they could not function without. And Ethan? The man who thought he could trade precision for aesthetics was watching the investor slip through his fingers in real time. When Lucas finished his update, I thanked him and hung up, my coffee still warm in my hand. I was not celebrating. Not yet. This was not the kind of victory you toast over dinner. This was the kind you let ripen, because the more time that passed, the more they would understand the cost of what they had done. And from the sound of it, the real cost was only starting to sink in. By the end of that week, the cracks in Ironcrest's polished image were no longer hairline. They were visible from across the street. Harrington Ridge had officially suspended negotiations, which, in the investment world, is just a courteous way of saying they have lost confidence and are pulling back. I read their statement in a market bulletin. Pending resolution of internal compliance concerns, all active discussions with Ironcrest Holdings are on hold. Those last two words, on hold, might as well have been a death sentence. Lucas told me that internally, the atmosphere was suffocating. Department heads were whispering in the halls. Analysts were quietly updating their resumes between meetings. Compliance was demanding records Ethan could not produce, and the IT team had confirmed there was no access to the core forecasting algorithms the investors had requested. In other words, they had lost the deal before they even admitted it to themselves. The board knew it. The investors knew it. And Ethan was still pretending he could turn it around with a rebranding of the proposal. But investors like Harrington Ridge do not forget humiliation. They had been promised a detailed, risk-adjusted, compliance-ready financial strategy. What they got instead was a slick slideshow built on data no one could verify. That kind of breach does not just kill a deal. It plants seeds of doubt that choke out every future conversation. If they could not be trusted on this, what else were they hiding? What other shortcuts were they taking? Trust is the currency of this business, and once it is devalued, the market moves on. I would be lying if I said I did not feel a quiet satisfaction reading between the lines of every public statement. And the same people who once applauded my thoroughness in private meetings were now seeing what happened without it. And the same man who told me investors do not have time for details was now discovering that details are the only thing keeping those investors in the room. Still, I stayed silent. No public comments, no gloating phone calls, no whispers to the press. I did not need to nudge this fire. It was burning on its own. Every day that passed without a resolution made Ironcrest look weaker. Every question Harrington Ridge asked that went unanswered drained whatever confidence they had left. And the beautiful part? I knew this was not the end. There was still one more shift coming, one that would take all that lost confidence and place it directly in my hands. Because when powerful people start looking for someone they can trust, they remember the ones who gave them the truth, even if they once thought it was too much to handle. And I had a feeling my phone would be ringing soon. And it happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where you almost convince yourself nothing will change. I was going over projections for a small renewable energy client when my phone lit up with a number I did not recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. But something in me said to pick it up. Camille Turner? The voice on the other end was deep, measured, and unmistakably confident. This is Daniel Whitmore, managing partner at Harrington Ridge. I straightened in my chair, the pen in my hand frozen midair. Daniel was not a man who called without purpose. He did not waste time on pleasantries. We have been following the situation at Ironcrest closely, he said, his tone polite but carrying an edge of amusement. Frankly, your models are the most thorough we have ever seen in this sector. We knew they did not build them. We also know you did. There was a pause, long enough for me to hear the faint hum of an office air conditioner on his end. We are launching a specialized investment fund. Long-term infrastructure, high regulatory oversight. I want you to lead the financial architecture. For a moment, I did not speak. Cause I was remembering the last time I'd heard the words too thorough from Ethan's mouth, and how quickly those same qualities were now being described as the most thorough we have ever seen. I finally said, and what makes you think I would be interested in working with anyone connected to Ironcrest's mess? Daniel chuckled softly. Because we are not Ironcrest. We do not dress numbers up for the sake of appearance. We value substance, Camille. And frankly, I suspect you are tired of having to convince people that accuracy matters. He was right. I was tired. Tired of explaining why cutting corners is not a strategy. Tired of being told that detail scares people off. Tired of watching people like Ethan land in leadership roles while the workhorses get sent home with cardboard boxes. But what he was offering was different. Not just a job, but a seat at the table from the very beginning, with investors who had already seen my best work and understood its value. I told him I would think about it, though in truth, I already knew my answer. When I hung up, I sat in silence for a while, the rain tapping against my window, realizing this was not just an opportunity. It was the turn in the story I had been waiting for. Ethan had tried to erase my name from Ironcrest's future, but in doing so, he had engraved it into the memory of the very people he was trying to impress. And now those people were offering me exactly what he had thrown away. Oh, it was not revenge in the loud, cinematic sense. It was quieter, cleaner, and far more satisfying. Because nothing speaks louder than being chosen by the same audience your opponent was trying to win. And knowing they did not just choose you, they came looking for you. And 2 weeks later, I walked into the Harrington Ridge headquarters for the first time as their newly appointed Director of Strategic Forecasting. The offer Daniel made had not just been generous. It had been on my terms. Full control over my team, freedom to use and further develop my proprietary models under Turner Analytics, and the authority to reject any deal that did not meet my standards for accuracy and compliance. No lighter, more digestible nonsense. No cutting corners to dress up a story. Here, the data would dictate the narrative, not the other way around. And on my first day, Daniel brought me into a meeting with the partners to discuss the launch of their new infrastructure fund. They wanted projections for the next 20 years, layered with compliance pathways for every regulatory body that could possibly touch the deal. In other words, they wanted the kind of work Ironcrest had once called too thorough. I presented my preliminary framework, walking them through risk scenarios and stress test simulations with the ease of someone who had done this for years without anyone in the room rolling their eyes. When I finished, Daniel simply said, "This is exactly why we called you." And for the first time in a long time, I believed him. Meanwhile, the news about Ironcrest trickled in through the industry grapevine. Harrington Ridge had officially withdrawn from the $120 million deal, citing unresolved compliance concerns. Other investors began backing away, their trust shaken. Ethan's name was no longer on the company website, and though no one said the word fired, the silence around his departure told me everything I needed to know. Ironcrest's share of the market slipped, and within months, they had become a cautionary tale whispered in conference rooms. The firm that thought charm could replace substance, and paid for it. While I will not pretend I did not feel a certain satisfaction watching it unfold. But it was not about gloating or proving a point. One, it was about knowing that the truth had done all the work for me. I did not sabotage anything. I did not burn bridges. I simply protected what was mine, held my ground, and let their own choices bring them down. Now, when I walk into the Harrington Ridge offices, I carry myself differently. Not because I am trying to prove something, but because I no longer have to. I am surrounded by people who value the same things I do. Precision, integrity, and the kind of foresight that keeps investors safe rather than dazzled. And every time I open one of my models, refining its layers and adding new predictive triggers, I am reminded that what they once called too thorough is exactly what secured my future. If there is one thing I have learned, it is this. You do not have to fight every battle head on. Sometimes the best revenge is letting people live with the consequences of underestimating you. While you move on to build something better, stronger, and entirely on your own terms. And that is exactly what I have done.